Alrighty. So thank you everybody online for joining us, and thank you everybody in the audience. Really appreciate you being here. We have a special treat tonight. Our main forum speaker is Gavin Hammond, who is a voice actor and wants to tell us about all of the things they have learned and some fun insights and hopefully some stories and maybe do some voices. All right, let's see. But thank you for coming.
Right, thanks for having me. Hi, my name's Gavin Hammond. I'm a voice actor. I have been a voice actor for about 20 years. You may have heard me in video games like Telltale's The Walking Dead, Red Dead Redemption 2, Diablo 4, League of Legends, Call of Duty, Halo, Far Cry, a whole bunch of stuff. You may have heard me do commercials for McDonald's, Hyundai, LifeLock, probably some other things too. And I've been teaching VO for about 10 years too. I teach at a school in San Francisco called Voice One. I also do private coaching. And my friend Chris Platts asked me to come and speak today a little bit about voiceover, especially how it relates to video games and stuff like that. So I grew up here in the Bay Area. I grew up watching a lot of TV in the 1970s and 1980s. Like the TV we'd be watching would be everything from Popeye that was made in the 30s and 40s, to Tom and Jerry, to Hanna-Barbera from the 60s, Looney Tunes in the 70s and 80s, Dungeons and Dragons, in the mid 80s. So it was always kind of a rich tapestry of stuff that we were exposed to, which was cool and helpful, especially if you spent a lot of time like I did building Legos and watching television. I always just liked to do voices and kind of emulate how people talked. I didn't really do impressions or anything like that, but I just thought it was interesting to just mimic, accents and things like that. I was always a pretty talkative kid. I knew what obnoxious meant at a very young age. And I studied a little bit of music growing up. I took piano lessons. When I was 12, I started taking drum lessons. Started taking singing lessons when I was like 14, and then throughout junior high and high school, sang in choir, did a little bit of acting, and but I was playing in bands too. When I went off to college in 1992, I got accepted to Cal and started there, and around 2.5 years into that, the band that I was in at the time, which was called Dance Hall Crashers, we started touring and making records, and so I had to drop out of school. Prior to that, I also studied a lot of foreign language in junior high and high school, so I had taken a bunch of linguistics classes prior to my exodus from school. And then the band toured pretty steadily for about 8 years. When that kind of wound down in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I was just working and, going back to school. And I was working in construction for my dad. And I was literally digging a ditch one day. And he called me and said, there's a lady on the radio, on the Ron Owens show on KGO, back before it was a sports betting radio station, back when there used to be talk radio. And he told me there's a lady on the radio that has a voiceover school, and you should listen to it, because, he knew that I had always done voices and been obnoxious. So I did. I listened to the radio, and it was Samantha Paris, who has a voiceover school in Sausalito called Voice Tracks. And it had never occurred to me that voiceover was something that was available to, non-actors. I always thought it was something that people on TV shows did in between gigs, or people that were just in LA, like doing animation all the time. I always sort of thought it was unapproachable. It never occurred to me that it was something to do. But I decided to take some classes and see what happened. I gave myself a 5-year window, mostly thanks to my wife's suggestion that I give myself enough time to sort of explore it and see if it was viable. And After about 5 years, I signed with my agent in San Francisco, Nate Tico at Stars. And from there, I just slowly started to build a career. Initially, I mostly just thought my approach should be, characters. I was always much more comfortable being other people than being myself, especially behind a microphone. But I quickly sort of learned that, the vast majority of the stuff I get asked to do is basically just this voice or just myself. So that was a difficult challenge for me to sort of get comfortable enough in my own skin to do like a spot for a hospital or something like that. I just didn't think that I had the empathy in my voice to really sort of pull off something like that. And then it turns out that I ended up doing a campaign for a hospital system in Indiana for, like the last 15 or 16 years, which is ironic and strange. But it was always something to me that seemed unapproachable. When I went back and restarted at school, I kind of had an idea that I wanted to do this. And so it made the most sense to me to pursue linguistics because I had already taken a bunch of foreign language classes. Most of like the cultural requirements that I had to take that were just part of the the UC general requirements were in linguistics because they were interesting to me. Language has always been interesting to me. So I pursued and got a degree, a bachelor's degree in linguistics, which I just thought would be helpful and applicable in some ways. I always thought my focus was dialects and things like that. So I thought, well, if I can find out the phonology and the phonetics of how, different people speak, how different dialects are actually built, in the larynx and the vocal folds, I thought that might be advantageous. Which it turned out to be because one of the jobs that I've probably has been the most lucrative for me was a little talking toy that from another planet called Furby. I'm probably not supposed to say that that's me, but for the last 15 or so years, I've been the voice of that character. And it was interesting because when I went for the audition for that, nobody had told me what it was for or what it was. Usually auditions are somewhat of a secret. That one especially, and I had to be on site, which was unusual. It wasn't an audition that I did at the agency or from my own home. So I had to go down there and then I knew the engineer really well because we had worked on other sort of interactive toys. And he was like, "Do you know what this is for?" And I was like, "No." And he told me and I was like, "Oh, wow." And initially it was a character that had one base personality, which sounds like this. Ooh. And then they had all of these other sort of ancillary personalities that it would change into, which was pretty strange. And I remember the way that it transformed was described as this orgasmic reaction, that it would go from saying two words, over, and its own word for over, which is uba. And so it would go switching between uba and over and then into this huge sort of orgasmic kind of, climax until it would switch to another personality. But I was doing, voices that were supposed to be female characters as well. I remember asking somebody else is covering those? I'm just like this one and then maybe this other one. They're like, no, you're all the voices. So I had to do sort of, characters that were more feminine, or more masculine. It was a little bit strange. The great leveler of that toy was that all of the audio was pitch shifted, like a cent or a cent and a half, they say, which is like a whole tone step on a musical scale. They'd pitch it up in order to make it sound, cuter and smaller and less orgasmic. But yeah, it's been a sort of a weird journey. I've been very fortunate to get to do lots of different kinds of things. If you're a Yankees fan, I do promos for the Yes Network from time to time. I did a commercial today for African swine flu, like a PSA. It's weird every single day. Yesterday was a video game for a developer I can't talk about. Interesting sort of side note is basically everything that I ever work on, with the exception of commercial stuff, is secret. By the time I've worked on something that's come out, nobody really cares anymore. But yeah, there's so many things that are in the ether that I never know when they're coming out. If they're coming out, you just sort of can't ever talk about them. Just sort of the nature of the job. I'm a walking NDA. And it's really fun. It's kind of a wild ride. Some of the major caveats are I have no job security ever. Even if I'm cast as like the lead in a video game, it's very likely, and has happened, that you just get recast without anybody even talking to you about it. I remember going to a GDC party for a developer, and they had scheduled and canceled sessions of mine for like the 2 weeks prior. Still invited me to their GDC party, but I get there and I asked one of the directors on the game, and I'm like, am I still like the guy in the game? And he's like, and I was like, oh, wow, this is awkward. So yeah, you never really have any security. You never really know if something's going to come through. I sort of joke with my wife. I'm sure it's super adorable after 20 plus years. Like, oh, that might be the last job I ever get. Better get a job in a kitchen, just because you never really know what's going to happen. I never really can predict what my schedule is going to be. It's like beneficial if I know something's happening next week or, in 3 weeks. That's great. I can plan on it. But it's not uncommon for one of my agents to call and be like, yes, can you be on the phone, or can you be, in front of your mic in 15 minutes or in 10 minutes? Can you be on your mic now? It happens, and it doesn't happen a lot, but it's definitely part of the job. Which is nice because, you never really know what's going to come up. It does lead to a lot of downtime, which can be, demoralizing. But it's a good career if you can find the work. It's a fun way to make money for sure. Even if I'm doing like a corporate narration for, some sort of software that I don't understand, it's certainly fun. And I just kind of enjoy all those aspects of it. Chris wanted me to talk specifically about how it relates to video games, how, video game casting comes to us, voice actors, how the packets look, what we sort of need from, an audition packet or someone's idea as to what they want their character to sound like, what we don't need from them too. Sometimes we get a ton of information, which is not super helpful. It's like, I don't need to know where my character went to high school. It's cool that, someone thought that much about it, but it's more just, you basically need whatever it is to get, your head around the role. And what sort of casting sides look like, which can be really different depending on, what the actual casting is for. We might get video game casting that is just a series of 3 or 4 sentences. And there are certain games too where we get casting for them all the time because they're like a MOBA, or something like that, a multiplayer online battle arena that they all have there's one particular one, and that every single casting of theirs always has this line, "Attack the Titan." Everyone. So it'll be like 3 lines that are actually in a character and then "Attack the Titan." No matter how many times those castings come through. I've probably read maybe 60 or 70 characters for this game. Always "Attack the Titan." So it's weird. And sometimes we get casting docs that are really robust. I remember for The Walking Dead, we got basically a screenplay. So we would have like 2 or 3 pages of what the characters are, what they look like, what their backstory is, what their occupation may be, how they've sort of found themselves in this zombie world that Robert Kirkman created, The Walking Dead. And then we would have 3 scenes, maybe two or 3 scenes, and it's like a screenplay. So you've got, basically your lines and how they're interacting with other characters. It really looks like something you might see for a television program. There might be scene direction and stuff in it as well. So it really can run the gamut. We can get very little information or we can get a ton of information. Totally depends on the developer. I would say for someone that's sort of presenting information to the actor, we mainly just want to see, ideally, a picture is fantastic, because we can inform our acting choices so much by knowing what the character looks like. If it has really big eyes, you might sort of play something in a more mesmerized way. A really big nose, you might change some of the sonics of, to make something more nasal, where I'm just going to pull my voice up into my hard palate.
Or you can even squeeze your own nose.
That can oftentimes impact sort of how understandable you can be, how intelligible, the dialogue can be. But yeah, pictures are super, super helpful. Also gives you an idea of the physicality. Something small might have a higher voice. Something big might have a bigger voice. You might also talk much slower if you're a giant creature, because, how slowly you move, or, there may be more effort, in moving an arm or something like that. Any of that physicality I can add, to a performance just to sort of make it jump off the page more. I mean, really, that's the job of any voice actor, is we're just trying to get whatever's written down off the page so that it sounds real, it sounds authentic, and it's believable, no matter what it is. With very few exceptions. Things like maybe narration or something, it's not as important. We just don't want to make it sound like we're reading it. There's a certain inflection that people will have when they're reading something. It tends to start at a spot and end at a spot. It goes high to low. So it's important for us, as like a narration job, to just make it still sound real. But it's okay if it sounds a little bit read. But like for a commercial, you never want that to sound read. You always want it to sound like you're an authentic person, authentically feeling that way about whatever the product is, in a way that the consumer will believe. Because if they don't believe it, then nobody's going to believe it, And if we don't believe it ourselves, everybody will hear that it's not believable. And the same applies with characters, for sure. So we always want to have those moments where you can make it real. Whenever I'm looking at a script, I always try to think of places where I can find pivot points, which are places where I can make there's like a beat, and I can make like an acting choice. I might have a line, that has, stop, go over there, do this thing. I can deliver those, in a certain way that just is very sort of straight and on the page, or I can try to think of some sort of physicality, some sort of situation where it might be happening, so it might be like, stop, and then come over here, and then like, go that way, where I'm obviously telling somebody to stop, I may be conferring with them or being sort of private and sort of discreet about it. And then maybe I'm telling somebody else to go away. It's like, if they don't make it clear to us in the audition sides, it's like on us to sort of get it off the page. And it may not be the right choice. Doesn't really matter. For an audition, it's more of just about getting noticed and someone hearing it and thinking that it's interesting, and then hopefully getting hired. In terms of like how we want to hear those sort of things, a lot of times we will get, too much information, backstory in a character that it's not that it's harmful or anything like that, but it's just not necessarily going to inform an actor's choices. We do need to know like their motivation, their disposition, if they're like cool, if they're not cool, if they're a villain, if they're a hero, if they're smart, if they're not so smart. All of those things can just help make informed acting decisions. And that's what we look for, anytime we have something that comes up that's at least like a new opportunity for us. And you never know. I mean, more so than anything else in this job, it's, most of the jobs that we read for, we're not going to book. Nobody may book it. It may just be something that goes out into the ether and never gets cast. It may just get canceled, or it may just be given to somebody that they already know and they've already worked with that doesn't even read it. But we always have to come into it like it's an opportunity. I have to do the best I can. And most importantly, I have to make a choice. Whatever my, audition's going to be, I need to make a choice about what the motivation or what the circumstances are for that particular type of job, or at least for that particular role. And a choice could be anything from, playing it like everything is a little bit sarcastic, or playing it like I know more than, I'm letting on, or, there's maybe a subtle wink and a nod, or maybe you're completely normal, and just kind of playing it as like a straightforward, you don't really have a motivation. You're just sort of letting things happen around you. But we have to make a choice. And then ultimately it comes down to selection rather than rejection. We don't get rejected for a role. We just get selected or not. And 9 times out of 10, like probably 99 out of 100, we'll never really know who booked that job. I'm never going to hear what anybody else did. Back in the old days, way before COVID, but back in the early 2000s, it was protocol that you would go to the agency to read whatever the auditions were for you. If you were fortunate enough to have an audition the next day, you'd get a call, usually 4 or 5 o'clock, the afternoon or evening before, and it'd be like, hey, we need you here at 9, or we need you here at 3:30, whatever. We need you here for such and such a thing. They probably don't even tell you what the audition was. It was a good thing if you had to be there at 9, because that meant you were sort of top of the list for whatever was coming through. So that was a positive thing. But if you're there in the afternoon, there may have been 100 people that came and read before you. And we would go and you'd get your copy, which is whatever your audition material is. If it was animation or a video game, they call them sides oftentimes. You would get whatever your sides or your copy is, and you would sort of sit quietly and read it to yourself. Maybe you'd find a corner and read it out loud. Then you'd go in the booth. You'd maybe get a little bit of booth direction from the director there if they felt like they had the time and the effort to give it to you. And depends on your relationship with them, if you were pretty comfortable with them. But mostly you would just sort of go, you'd spend your 5 minutes there, and then you'd get back in your car and schlep home, which was quite challenging. These days, that is all but gone. There really aren't booth directors at agencies anymore. We just basically get the copy emailed to us. Sometimes you have several days to do it. Sometimes it's due as soon as possible. Ideally, the sooner the better. And sometimes if you get something, especially if you get a casting that's as soon as possible, it can often mean that whoever sends it back gets submitted right away. So the quicker you turn that thing around, the faster you're in the pipeline to be listened to. But these days, everything is online, everything is from home. COVID really changed things hugely. Because, before COVID, we would have to go to studios, pretty much all the time. If I had a really good week, I would be leaving the house, at 6 o'clock in the morning and getting home at 8 because I was, working a session in the morning that I'd have to commute to. If I was lucky, I would have 3 sessions after it. I would go through the city and have a job, maybe go to the city and have another job, and then maybe back through Emeryville or Oakland and have a job on my way home. And those were really good days. Which can really wear you out. When I was working on Furby, I was also working on The Walking Dead Season 2. And so there were a lot of days where I was commuting from my house, which is in the North Bay in Benicia, to going basically down to San Carlos, which is a trek. And then if I had to be at the, for The Walking Dead, any of the Telltale stuff, it was in Fairfax. So that was quite a big circle. A lot of bridge tolls, a lot of gas. But these days everything's from home. It's starting to open up a little bit more where video game studios especially are, wanting people to be on site, which is cool, but a lot of those get recorded in Los Angeles. And if you have an agent in Los Angeles, as I do, I have to be there. They represent me as a local talent. So if I audition for something that is saying it's going to record there, the expectation is if they want me, I have to be there, which is fine. It's usually I have to do it, you have to do it on your own dime. So that makes it cost prohibitive for certain types of things. Some work pays much better than others. There can be a huge discrepancy just depending on the kind of work it is. Dubbing, for example, like dubbing work, anime, or dubbing foreign films and stuff, usually pays less than $100 an hour, versus a video game session, which usually pays about $1,100 or $1,200 for a 4-hour session, and that's the scale rate. If you're better, you can have double scale, or you can ask for double scale, triple scale. Some actors get just a flat fee because they're that good and that well known. So it can be strange. It can be a lot of sort of weird circumstances, and the logistics of the job can be really complicated too. But if you have the wherewithal and the interest in doing it, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's the best job in the world. I love it. Every day, every session I get to do, no matter what it is, it's great. Even bad sessions, are still pretty good days. Usually. Depends on how they all sort of work out. I've had days where you go into the session. There was one, I was working on a video game, and the client, it was all sort of alien speech, which it was scripted, which is nice, but it was alien speech, no vowels. So it was all just sort of X, K, R, S, H, the weird sort of sounds. And I remember going in, and I ran down my first line. This was one of those days where I had had several jobs prior to that, so I was probably not in my best sort of vocal state at that point. But I remember the client, who was in the UK, and this was like a 5 o'clock session for me, so it was probably like 3 o'clock in the morning for this guy, and he had probably been in these sessions all day. And I delivered my first line, and he just laughed. And I was like, huh. And he wanted to speak to the producer on the project. And I was like, well, I'm going to pack my stuff because I'm pretty sure this guy's sending me home. So they're not always fun. I remember when we worked on Furby, some of the first lines that we did for, because I localized the toy as well. That's one way where my linguistics degree came in handy. We did all the American or all the English US stuff for the toy, and then my agent called me, and she was like, "Yeah, so the developer's looking at your website, and it says that you have a linguistics degree." And I'm like, "Yes, that is true." I'm like, "Because they would like to localize this toy," and I was like, "I am the most qualified person on the planet to localize this toy." And they're like, "Great, they want to do a Mandarin demo next Wednesday," and I was like, "Mandarin? Okay." And I got there, and the script was in Mandarin. And I was like, well, I can't read the language. And they'll have a native speaker there. And I'm like, okay. So the native speaker was there. They did, I think, come up with a Romanized script for me for that first day. But it was basically just a native speaker, not like not a language teacher or anything like that. It was just somebody that worked there that spoke the language. And she would say, "Okay, try this. Whoa." And I'm like, "Whoa." And she's like, "No." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And I try it again. "Whoa." "No." I'm like, "What's wrong with it? You have to tell me what to do, otherwise I'm not going to be able to do anything." I think that first session we recorded maybe in an hour. I think we recorded maybe 4 lines, which is not a lot. My record of recording, lines for a Leapfrog project is we did 1,000 lines in an hour. But that was smoking. That was really kind of flying through things, and that was English, much easier for me. So eventually that project, they sort of contracted with a language school down in San Carlos, who they then sent people who taught languages that I could at least mimic, which was very helpful. But yeah, so we localized that toy into 13 different languages that I performed myself, which I don't know had been done before. I'm not sure. And we've since done it on other projects for that. But so that was kind of cool. And that's where the linguistics really kind of came into play. But it can be very weird. I remember with the Japanese session for that, I said the first line, and it was me in the booth with the engineer and one of the sort of, the puppeteering and sort of technology sort of heads. So it was a big deal. And it was a session with Takara Tomy, in Japan, and it sounded like there were 10 or 15 people in there. And I said my first line, and it was just laughter on the other end of the phone. And then one of them said, was that Japanese? And I said, you tell me. And they said, no. So then they wanted to talk to they wanted to have a private conversation with the producer. And I'm like, well, I'm going to pack my stuff. That's one thing I'm pretty good at, is knowing when they're going to send me home. It's only happened a couple of times, but it definitely happens sometimes. So not a job to have a thin skin. Very often we're talked about in the third person when we're in the booth. Even when you can hear them on the talkback in the studio, you can hear them sort of talk about, well, why is he doing this? Or why are they doing that? Just the nature of the beast. You kind of have to have a thick skin to sort of get by and make a living of it. But it is super fun. And I am reaching basically the end of my pre-prepared, quote unquote, spiel about myself.
Want to open up Q&A?
I would love to open up a Q&A if anybody has questions. I'm happy to answer any questions at all about voiceover, or specifically about game voiceover, how you might go about presenting something, who you might present it to. One of the drags is any sort of agent, talent agent, they will do castings for free. You present something to them and you say, I have this project and I would love to get voices on it, but it kind of has to be a paid project. There needs to be a budget because they take their money, they usually take a percentage of what we would make, either 10% or 20%, depending on your deal and depending on whether it falls under a union contract or doesn't. So that would be the thing. And it really just can kind of vary depending on how it works. You can always approach voiceover schools, and that's what I would say is probably a really good outlet, is to talk to somebody like myself, somebody who's like a faculty at a voiceover school, because I know students, so it's like I could send something to people and just be like, hey, you want to just kind of riff on something with somebody? They're looking for voices to create, they have ideas. Do you want to fiddle and have fun? And a lot of voice actors are, or folks that are training to be voice actors or studying to be voice actors, they just really want that experience. They want the opportunity to do something and contribute to something. I think for most folks, it's just about creating or being part of some kind of creation. Initially, that's what's fun. And then eventually you want to have a job.
You got a question from online?
Awesome.
If you don't mind repeating it back.
Not at all.
You got the microphone. They wanted to ask about the sort of process for dubbing stuff for Nintendo stuff. They recall hearing you in Fire Emblem Engage Heroes. So
Yeah. So dubbing for Nintendo specifically, or dubbing for any real sort of developer, it really depends on the type of project. Specifically for Fire Emblem Engage, there were not, as I recall, a whole lot of lines that I was actually dubbing, in the sense that I was not replacing. I'm sure I was, but I don't believe that they were presented in the way that a lot of those are. I've recently worked on a game that's a kind of a big deal that's dubbed that I don't think I can talk about because we're still under NDA, where I would hear the original performance, and this is very common. Hear the original performance in Chinese or Korean or Russian or Japanese, and then I have to sort of match the timing of their performance to, my performance has to match their timing. Either because there are lip flaps where I can see their lips moving and I need to sort of try to capture that, which I don't know, for some reason I have kind of a natural skill set for that. I'm also a drummer, so it's like I can see kind of the timing and think about it. But yeah, for Fire Emblem, I don't remember that being the case. I think it was more, and those were super fun sessions because I got to work with a friend of mine, Patrick Seitz, who's another phenomenal voice actor. He was directing those. And a lot of times his direction would just be something like, okay, 1,000-yard stare, and you're just like, oh, I know what that sounds like. Something like that. So I don't remember there being that sort of, A-B process where I would hear the original, the OV, or the original actor, the OA, whatever you want to say. It's different from different different sessions. I don't remember hearing, anything and then having to match it. I think it was more just like, here's the line, and it needs to be roughly this amount of time. Usually there's enough flexibility. For some things where they really are matching, lip flaps, especially like dubbed film, it's definitely much more specific and challenging, to the point where we may have to like really kind of tweak the line in order to make it fit with the lip flaps. You'll have like the director looking at it, we're all watching the video. Even if I'm at home, it's like I'll have whatever the dubbing software is up on my monitor in my studio at home, and I'll have my mic and I'll have the script in front of me. But the script is often like running in the dubbing software, and you'll kind of be looking at it and you'll be like, it seems like he's making like an O sound there. There's like a labial. So it's like, maybe we change this line to this, or maybe add this, or just sort of tweak it in a way. That's a much more collaborative process. But I remember Fire Emblem was basically just a pretty straightforward game. Yes, Mason.
So that kind of made me think of a question.
Excellent.
A good question from them. But so it feels like you're kind of part of localization no matter what if you're doing dubbing, because it's you and maybe some of the people in the room, it sounds like, but it seems like a lot of that weight is on you to match the lips. And so suddenly you're changing one sentence, we got to go somewhere, to whatever it is, and so you got to say that in a completely different way. That's got to come with some localization, some flavor, right?
Yeah, definitely. We have to sort of localize based on whatever makes the most sense, and those are calls that are made by the director. It's like, I'm not necessarily the one that's responsible for sort of making those calls. I like to try to help out. Having a linguistics degree, I like to just I have ideas for things. I'm also probably more clever than I think I am, or I'm probably less clever than I think I am. So I'm often trying to help as much as possible. But sometimes you don't need the help, because the engineer and the director and the producer, they're all trying to help each other. So it's just like another voice in the picture. But it's kind of, in a sense that it's kind of localized because we are localizing something for from a foreign market for this market. Not in the sense that we're taking our original product and then like doing the localization ourselves. And I think with the case of, with Furby was, I don't think that the company, like the main manufacturer, wanted to relinquish, as much of the control to other markets when they could hold on to it for us. And that, the great leveler of that toy too was that it has its own language. So we could always say, yeah, but it's just learning the language from your dumb kids. So it's like, if it doesn't have a perfect French accent, yeah, it's not gonna, but there are definitely like, localities where they're kind of like, oh, well, we don't understand it. If it doesn't sound, if it does not sound French, then it's like, they don't get it. They're like, oh, no, it doesn't make sense. And we kind of like, okay. But we would try to just be like, but it's an alien, and it's like, it sounds like it. It's like if a tourist were speaking poorly, they might also say the same thing. They just don't understand it. So there was definitely some finessing involved, as there always is in localization. And another thing too, it's like, just as an example of how those all sort of come together, it's like, it's kind of different every single time. You might work for the same company, the same developer, the same, on different projects, and that project might even be completely different. There's very few times where the protocol is always the same. There are some where it's very consistent, but more often than not, you just kind of have to adapt to the different protocols depending on what that particular client wants. Even if like I know the production company really well, they're my client. They're the ones that are paying me and hiring me, but their client is the one that's paying them, that's creating the thing in the first place. So the end client is ultimately, going to dictate a lot of those procedures. To a degree. With like video games, there's more of a, you came to us, this is how we do it. And, you sort of get familiar with that process. But that's not always the case. It can definitely vary. Yes?
So with the pandemic, you were saying that a lot of the voice recording was happening within people's homes at that point.
Yeah.
So you kind of had to. So I think that like even we're sitting here and there's like a hum in the background.
Oh, yeah.
And like that's pretty insane to kind of require that every single voice actor have to up their audio recording game. So like, did all the onus go onto you, or did the sound engineers just have to deal with it?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, as you point out very accurately, we have these lights above us that are making a certain amount of noise. So was the onus upon us, the actor, none of us are engineers. We're all sort of barely engineers. It's like, I can push record and I can push stop. Was the onus upon us to sort of make sure the audio was, of a good quality? Absolutely. So for me, I was already in a position where I, was very fortunate in that I got to work and I got to do stuff, but it was like, if I have to drive to San Francisco, from my house, it can take me 40 minutes or it can take me 2 hours and 40 minutes, just depending on the day, depending on the traffic. And it's like, if I'm going to the studio to do maybe like 3 promo codes, where I'm saying like, text the word aware to such and such, it's like, can't I do that from home? So I was like, I got a mic, that was comparable to that studio. I tried to match what I knew that they had at the studio, which was a Sennheiser 416. It's like a Foley mic that people use, but for some reason it's become a very popular broadcast mic. So I got one of those just with the kind of, intention of like, maybe I can just do those from home because it'll take me like 4 minutes in the booth versus, 3 hours of travel. Can we do that? So I was really actively trying to be proactive so that I could do as much as possible from home, because to me, that was like the dream, was to walk downstairs, turn on the switches, and make a little money. So yeah, for sure, when the pandemic hit and everybody had to be recording from home, it was either like within the first few weeks, it was like, who has a home studio? Agents were freaking out, like, okay, who's ready for this? Because most of us weren't, especially in certain major markets, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago. It's like, you might have a setup at home so you can do your auditions and stuff, but you weren't production ready, so we had to get to a point where we could really be doing production from our houses. I remember I reached out to a friend of mine, another teacher at Voice One, Jim Edgar, who's a phenomenal tech guy, and he's kind of the guru that I send people to if they have sonic issues. And I did like a quick sort of 1 hour with him where I kind of tested some stuff, and he made some suggestions about just like more insulation, more baffling in my little booth, so I could do things that were really projected and didn't sound, like just sort of blowing out this tiny room and reverberating all over the place. But I remember, like, I was fortunate to work on this Lego animated show, Lego City, for a few years. And I remember we kind of shut down production right in the middle because of COVID. And we had some of these early sessions where we had like 10 people on a Zoom call, like directing and doing voices. And it was like every time somebody would join, there's a little trick when you're, working in, IPDTL or Source Connect. These are the software programs that will bridge the gap so that like another studio can record my audio from home. It's like a replacement for what used to be ISDN, just like this phone line connection that people would use so that you could record from home, because basically you could send them a strong enough signal, a wide enough bandwidth signal that they could like use it in production rather than just like a compressed MP3. And I remember early in those sessions, it was like somebody would join Zoom and like not leave Zoom audio because we're all hearing you over Source Connect or IPDTL. And you would get into this feedback loop of somebody talking, and it would like reverberate around everybody's speakers, and it would just be this weird cacophony of sound. It was definitely extremely challenging, I'm sure, for a lot of those poor engineers who are already overworked and have very challenging jobs because they have to deal with people like me, and they also have to deal with producers and directors and animation studios and whatnot. So yeah, we all had to basically, if we wanted to keep working, you had to have production quality audio that you could deliver from your house. In my case, I was fortunate. All I really had to do, was put up some more foam, put some more baffles in, kind of back up my bass traps, which are things that you put in the corners of the ceiling of a room. My booth is tiny. I'm like the only person that'll fit in it. It's basically like 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and 6 feet high. People like probably wouldn't fit. I think all of you would fit. Maybe not you. Probably not Mason. But pretty much it's a tiny space and it fits me. So I just had to do very minimal kinds of things, which wasn't too bad. But for all of this sort of, the commercial stuff, I was already pretty much ready to go just because I didn't want to be commuting anymore. I don't live in a major market. Yeah.
I have a question on your booth. Did you elevate it so this was, there are two questions.
Yeah.
So first of all, did you build the booth before the pandemic? And then secondly, how is it kind of isolated from all of the rest of the room? Are you building it inside of your house? Another booth?
Yeah, so I did build my booth myself, shabbily, of course. But I also, so being a drummer, being a musician, I had this room in my house. When my wife and I bought our house in 2000, we had basically just kind of an unfinished basement down there. So we just, we raised the house a couple of feet and had to redo, it was all the surfaces, inside and out, top to bottom. So I kind of staked out a room in the basement down there to soundproof, for music, because I thought we're going to have bass and drums down here. It's going to be loud as heck. The neighbors are going to hate it. So I had used mineral wool industrial insulation that my dad had laying around in, his, construction yard in Oakland. And I just sort of put all that in the joists and then put perforated metal on the walls. And so it was already a quieter space. I eventually hung sheetrock in order to put junk on the walls and that sort of thing. And then when I built my booth, I basically just built a freestanding structure, but I floated my own floor. So I kind of just put, foam and, and rubber and stuff down underneath it and then kind of created a floor there. It's not acoustically sound, but it's quiet enough that I don't hear people coming downstairs. I don't hear leaf blowers outside, or more importantly, I might hear it, but my microphone does not. So yeah, that's the thing. It's pretty easy to get. They're not cheap. They're quite expensive, but you can buy prefabricated, or at least booths that you build yourself. There's a bunch of different companies that make them, and they're quite nice, but they are very expensive. But they're acoustically treated, so it's kind of like you're getting something from there. I built mine and then had to, make it sound good over the course of many years that I'm still sort of working at. But it's gotten to the point now where, yeah, it sounds good. And I just used, when I built my booth, I probably spent a total of maybe $300 on it. And that was mostly just the wood. I bought a little bit of Owens Corning, 402 or 403 board. It's an acoustic material. It's very rigid. And those panels were a little bit expensive. And then I'd used duct liner, which is another insulation material that you can buy at Home Depot, and just hung all that stuff and did all that myself. I'm not handy, but I am the son of a contractor, and he's always been wrenching on his house my whole life, so I can use a screw gun, and I can at least put things in the walls and hang them. Most of the construction stuff is not that complicated. The acoustic stuff I needed help with, and that's when I reached out to Jim Edgar, just to make sure it sounded okay. But listening to it, you spend so much time kind of in there recording that you get a feel for what it sounds like. And I just never really got negative feedback from clients. I still haven't had, knock on wood, I still haven't had a circumstance where they've said oh, we can't work with you because it sounds too bad. There are, a lot of, especially because of all of those sort of COVID ups and downs, with home studios and stuff, there are a lot of developers that are no longer willing to work with home studios. But I think either grandfathered in, or I'm always willing to do an audio check, which is usually what a new client will do. They'll be yeah, they want to book 15 minutes the day before or something like that, where, you just talk with the engineer and they record you in silence just to make sure that the noise floor, you don't have a light that's buzzing or a fan that's going, or that you don't have your computer in there with a fan going. And I don't have any of that stuff in there. I have a monitor that very low latency and doesn't have any signal noise or anything like that, and my mic, and then I run all that stuff out, to my computer that's outside the booth. It's just over there. But, it'd be great to have it in the booth where you could adjust levels and stuff like that. But I usually just pop out and turn things up or down. Yeah. Good question. Thank you. Yes.
When you were starting out, what did you bring to your aid? How do you begin?
So how I began was I took classes. I knew, and it is something that is approachable. Like I mentioned, when I sort of in my opening, that I didn't know that it was something that people could just kind of do. So it is, but there's gatekeeping for sure. One of the things that really kind of was tough for me, and this is where my wife was like, you need to give it 5 years and you need to try, was I would go to classes and I would like do what I did and I'd get feedback that was like, yeah, great, come on out. Like, okay. I wouldn't get feedback that was like actionable or anything that was like what to work on or what was good or what was bad. It was just kind of like, yeah, fine. Which is cool, but that's not why I was taking classes. It's not why I was there. I wanted to do it. I wanted opportunities. At schools, you don't get casting opportunities usually. Voice tracks where I took classes, there would be, maybe a casting call once every, 3 months or 6 months or something like that. And it was usually like a very open call. Like I would go, and I'm like this 30-something white guy, and then there would be, a 70-year-old lady, and I would be kind of like, okay, so this is obviously a huge sort of, they're just a very wide net. And for me, it was like, okay, I learned pretty early on, I want to take classes with people that can hire me, or people that have opinions about what we're doing, or I want to take sort of direct coaching with people that I really are going to give me feedback that I want to hear, which is like, that was no good, or this sounds phony, or this sounds this, like at least people that were giving me feedback. And so I started doing that. I was still taking classes for things I wanted to know, more broad subjects, because you really do, especially in the Bay Area, to have a career, you have to be able to do as much as possible. Like I did a PSA today, a video game yesterday. I do promos sometimes, I do toys sometimes. It's like I do lots of different kinds of work, and there are a lot of different kinds of voiceover. There's a lot of opportunities, and there's opportunities for every kind of voice in the world. So for me, I was like, I need to know more things. And then I was taking classes with people, or taking, coachings with people that were really gonna at least give me stuff I could use. And then I started taking classes that agents were teaching, because I was like, okay, I feel like I could do this. I feel like if I had opportunities, I could maybe book something, or I could maybe just sort of be out there, and I really wanted to be having those opportunities. So I started taking classes that agents were teaching, that their booth directors were teaching, people that would hear you and could bring you in for something, or could call you and give you a shot at something. And then through sort of taking classes with them, I just tried to be friendly. I would bring them cookies, or I would, at the time I was brewing beer at home, and so I would bring them a beer that I'd made or something like that. I just tried to be not asking for anything. I tried to just show up on time, do a good job, and try to be cool, so that they wouldn't be like, oh, this guy. I would sort of invite them, in voice tracks in Sausalito, there's a bar, Smitty's, down the street. I would say hey, yeah, you want to grab a beer at Smitty's or something like that? A bunch of us are going to go, or just little opportunities like that where I just, I wanted to be not a pain in the ass to them, which has still been, my MO. Yeah.
So it sounds like you're networking with, the possibility of throwing it out there. Or
yeah,
the idea of you're not that guy. It's like, hey, it's always great to see him. Always,
Yeah, I was definitely trying to network in that sense and foster a relationship with those people where they didn't feel like I just wanted something from them, because they know that they have this power, to make or break, anybody that's there in the classes, or bring somebody in if they think, they're worth bringing in. And I just wanted to show them that I didn't want anything from them. I did, of course, I wanted opportunities, but I definitely wanted to at least present myself as just being like cool and competent and attentive and interested and like willing to show up and willing to do stuff. And then at one point after, maybe during one of these classes that I took with my agent, with Nate, and he said like, so what's your story? And I was like, I don't have a story. I would love to have a story. And he was like, all right, I think I'm going to start bringing you in for some stuff. And I was like, fantastic. And then initially he did what was called hip pocketing, where they put you in their hip pocket. They bring you in for stuff without, contractually signing you to be on the roster part of the agency. And then I think maybe a month or two into that, getting a few opportunities here and there, I actually booked something. It may have been something that they even pitched me for. That's where your agent says like, hey, listen to this guy, for this particular casting that you're doing. Listen to him. He's probably the right guy. And they're like, yeah, sure, whatever. For a commercial for, an auto body shop or something like that, they may not be all that particular. And they're like, yeah, it sounds fine. And then I think as that started to go, I was like, hey, why don't you sign me? And he's like, oh, yeah, why don't we? And then that just sort of, I just leveraged it into that. And through the same sort of way, through classes is how I got signed with, my first agent in Los Angeles was just by doing one of these classes where it was like one person wins the opportunity to go and read at that agency. And because I had a website, I think at the time, I was that person. This was in 2006 or 2007 or something. So, yeah. Mason.
I was going to say 5, but I also always have the question for everybody. First I have a question more related to what you're still talking about.
Cool.
You're talking about relationships and that being a big part of it. Portfolio is the other huge one that I see across all of these digital entertainment careers. Had you built a pretty big portfolio before you had even done this?
Yeah, portfolios for voice actors are usually demos. A demo tape or a demo CD. These days, they're just MP3s. And yeah, those are definitely a huge part of getting your foot in the door. They're also the way that your agent might pitch you for, new work or for new business to somebody. So my demos are, I made a new character demo, I think in 2022, but my commercial, demo is terrible and, should be replaced. But I made it myself. So I made it from, audio that I had of commercial spots that I had done. So at least it's like real stuff. It's not like, something, my initial demo was something that I wrote, with one of my teachers at the time. But when I made my first commercial demo, it was something I made myself. But yeah, our portfolios these days, and there's, a lot of different things that people have. There might be like video demos, especially if you do a lot of animation and interactive, you're going to have a demo that shows actual scenes. If you do motion capture, which is a big part of voiceover that I didn't really mention because I don't do a ton of it. I don't live in Los Angeles. That's where a lot of that work happens. But that's where you're on a sound stage and you got the suit with the balls on it and stuff, and you move around and have to hold props and do all that sort of stuff, motion capture. Yes.
I was going to say, so you've obviously done a lot of acting in games. You've done the toys and that, and so and you're here at the museum. So, what's your favorite game? Don't have to, or what's your favorite game? Doesn't have to be your favorite game.
Oh man.
A favorite game.
Oh geez, a favorite game.
Favorite projects you worked on in the general categories, right? Like.
Oh wow.
Game that you can talk about.
Oh boy. So my favorite game to play, and this is still true, if I'm going to think of like all time, it would probably be Diablo 2. Thank you. That I still play and have played way too much to this day, which is Destiny 2. I'm a big first-person shooter guy. I love Destiny, like, a lot. I still play that a lot. But I love games. I've been a gamer my entire life. I consider myself a first-generation gamer because we had Pong in 75 or so whenever it came out. My dad has always really liked games. We've always had systems at home, and I've never not been, spending way too much time playing games. My favorite projects that I've worked on, I mean, commercial projects, nobody really cares. So, but for toys, it's gotta be Furby, because there's so much stream of consciousness nonsense in there that is just me straight off the dome. That's just like random weird lines that are too long, but they make people laugh, and they're just in that voice, and they're just stupid. But it's just
the big sleep line.
I don't know.
Because you did the modern Furby.
I did. I've been the voice since like 2010. So yeah, that would be one of the more favorites. I'm just kind of proud of those. I think it's cool that I got to localize it, that they let me. It was a neat thing to do. It was really lucrative too. It was, you know, when we would like work on those things too, it'd be like, yeah, they're checking your avail for the next 3 months. Hopefully 20 hours a week. And be like, but yeah, that was super fun. In terms of games I worked on, it's got to be, I mean, I can't not say The Walking Dead, just because I think people are going to be disappointed if I don't. But I like a lot of the games that I've worked on. Animation would be that Lego show. That was super fun. I don't do a ton of animation. Yeah. What are you guys chatting about over there?
Chris, that's one last question.
Yeah.
I just had to ask one last question.
Sure.
Any advice for dungeon masters who like to do voices for
Yeah, man.
giggles, and also maybe for indie developers who maybe have to do their own voices?
Advice for dungeon masters and indie developers, man, you just keep doing you, because you have all the good instincts. It's more just it's fun, you know. It's like, if you're not having fun doing a voice, it's like it's not really worth it. And I think just trying it and just putting something out there, just making a voice is I don't know. It's such a liberating thing, just pretending to be somebody else. I would say, yeah, take chances. Don't be afraid that anybody's going to laugh at you, because they probably won't. And if they do, hopefully it's for the right reason, you know? But yeah, a lot of times it's really intimidating, especially like hearing yourself in headphones, you know, through a microphone. I've been doing it for 20 plus years, so it's like I'm used to what I sound like with headphones on, but it can be really sort of disorienting. A lot of people sort of struggle with it. It can be really kind of strange, but you just get used to it, and don't worry about, you know, people hearing it and giving you negativity. And if they do, screw them. It doesn't matter. They're not worth it. Yeah.
Favorite voice or most memorable line?
My favorite voice or most memorable line would probably be like a line from The Walking Dead, which was like, it's 3 words, and it was just, take the kids, which was it's very simple, but it was like, I particularly loved that scene and just kind of the way it played out. I was so honored to work on that game, just because the writing was so good that there were certain times where I was reading something and it's almost like I knew where it was going. I could just kind of feel what was going to happen. And then like, there were certain times where things just fell into place and felt perfect. It was really an honor to get to work on something like that, especially because I still have people that reach out to me. I mean, this was a game that, you know, I worked on it in 2012. I think we did the second one in 14, and then I might be in the third one in 2016. That's kind of spoilery though. But so for me, it was like a 3-project gig that kind of went on and on and on. And it was just, the writing was so good. It felt like such an honor to get to work on it. And the fact that it still means something to people, that people still reach out to me almost every day and just say something like, hey, you were so good. And it's such a trip, because we really do we get to play in these universes. We're so sort of fortunate to get to work on these things. But then for it to mean something to somebody is just, I mean, you could never ask for anything more. It's incredible.
Awesome. Everybody, a round of applause for Gavin.
Thank you so much. And you should come and check out Made. This is probably the coolest place I've ever been in my life.